The Grob meets its match. Side 1. Shortly after releasing the tape on the Macho Grob, I played in the British Championship and played the Grob opening, both sides, every round. The score was 5.5 out of 11, which is in fact worse than mediocre because many of the opponents were not the strongest ones in the tournament, it being a Swiss tournament. Now I've divided the games into 3 camps. There are the lines where white plays c4 and d4, and there were the ones where, as black, I had to face open aggressive white play with pawn moves such as h4 and knight c3, but not pawn to c4. And finally the games as white where the opposition almost invariably defended with the pawn c6 variations. That's the more passive defensive formations. Now the first game on the tape was played in the first round of the tournament, and it's a massacre by G.H. James, famous South Sussex player. Now, white began pawn c4, black g5, pawn d4, h6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, and now, as recommended on the tape, the Macho, c5. Now white could here defend with bishop e3, but in this game he played knight e2. And here black played knight from b8 to c6. Presumably if white now captures on c5, black will sacrifice a pawn by pawn to b6. White in fact defended the centre with bishop to e3. And now, as I've mentioned on the tape, black can either take on d4 or play queen to a5. That is, probably take on d4 and then play queen to a5. In this game he played one of the recommendations, pawn to b6. This I'd used with success against Roger Lancaster in the King's Head tournament. The disadvantage of the move is that it's somewhat constricting. The black's queen becomes constricted, her diagonal is shut, and it's often very useful to be able to bring her out to a5 or b6. Now white of course shouldn't capture the pawn, because after he does, and with the bishop on c5, black can play queen a5 and rook b8 with very strong play. However, white now chooses to play pawn to d5. Black moved his knight to e5, and white played knight to g3. This sets black some problems because there are threats of coming in either on f5 or h5. So black solved this by playing knight to g6, as in the game against Lancaster, and white now played knight h5, and here black tried to maintain his hold of the e5 square by going bishop to e5. Now in view of the outcome of this game, it might have been better to play bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and now d6. Then black has some problems that he isn't able to develop his knight to f6 without allowing doubled pawns. But these doubled pawns may not be that serious, as we'll see. Let's say after d6, if white plays f4, black could play now knight to f6. And if white plays knight takes f6, black plays e takes f6. And black's going to be able to put his queen on e7 to put pressure against white's pawn at e4, and possibly bring his king round to the queen side later on. So this is a possible suggestion for an improvement in black's play. Now the actual game went, if you'll have the pieces returned to the position after black plays bishop e5 and white plays pawn to g3. That will be diagram 1. Now, from diagram 1, white plays this pawn to g3 move, and now black has got some problems in preventing pawn to f4. So he chose to play here knight to f6, and white wasted no time playing pawn to f4. Of course, if white does delay anything, he's going to get into a position where he has no control over the e5 square, so he has to strike very quickly against black. Hence he's throwing everything forward. Pawn to f4, this is in fact a pawn sacrifice. Now, black can take this pawn in a couple of ways. I chose to take it with bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and now knight takes e4. There was actually another way that black could play it after white's pawn to f4, and that was to play knight takes knight on h5. And if white took on e5, pawn takes e5, black could then move his knight back to g7. And it looks like black's going to win the pawn at e5, which is in fact quite true. However, what I didn't like about the position was white playing then pawn to h4. And black will capture, pawn takes h4, white pawn takes h4, black knight takes e5, and now possibly white plays pawn to h5. And the problem is the knight at g7 doesn't look very secure at all. Well, I suppose actually also instead of pawn to h5, white could also play rook to g1, and this immediately puts pressure on the g7 knight. And if black has to play something like king f8, well, this is obviously a very bad position. So that was why I didn't win the pawn in that way. So let's return to diagram 1, and white's just played pawn to g3, and black played knight f6, and white now played pawn to f4. Now, as I've said, black won the pawn in a different way here. He played g takes f4, white g takes f4, bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, and now knight takes e4. And here white's bishops begin to get weaving. White played bishop d3. Of course, it's quite irrelevant of black to take the pawn on c3, and that would get destroyed by queen c2. So black brought his knight back to d6. He could have gone back to f6, but I don't think that was that much better either. So knight to d6. Now you might like to consider how white should continue his attack here, and so turn off the tape and have a look at the position. Now white chose to play queen to g4, which was the move black expected, and black here played his queen to c7. Now the idea was that if white plays bishop takes g6, black can now play rook to g8, and he's perfectly okay, his position's perfectly alright, and he might even be able to get his king onto the queen side soon. Or if white plays bishop takes f7 check, just king takes f7, and again white's attack has ground to a halt. However, white found a much stronger move than bishop takes g6. He played pawn to f5. Of course, looking back on it, it's rather difficult to foresee this sort of move at the point where you grab the pawn on e4. However, on general grounds, this is a position where the tactics are quite liable to work in white's favour because of the constriction of black's position. Pawn to f5, black played knight e5, and the white queen swooped in, queen to g7, hitting the rook and knight. Black now took his booty, knight takes d3 check, white played king e2, black played rook f8, and white played bishop takes h6. Now black's absolutely finished. Of course, if black had had one more move at his disposal, say his bishop was on a6, he could now castle queenside. But he hasn't got that one move, and therefore he's got no way of defending his rook on the king side. He played something like king e8, queen takes f8 check, knight to d8, but he never got much play for the loss of material. Well, as I said, that was a heavy defeat, but well, the b6 line, that is 6b6, isn't one which I'm always too happy with. So perhaps next time I'll take on d4 and bring the queen out to get freer play. In general, I very rarely lose against white's one pawn to c4. In this tournament, I beat Small when he played such a structure. That game can be found on the cassette, the one and only Tony Miles, at the end. And then there was the game against Townsend, in which Townsend played almost exactly the same as the game Tisdall Basman, except I didn't sacrifice the two rooks. Townsend managed to escape to an endgame, and it was a terrific struggle, but black eventually managed to win that game. He had, of course, always a slight advantage because of the doubled white pawns on the queen side. But, well, the game went up and down for quite a long time, though, due to the ineptness of the play. So we won't go through those games. We're going to pass on to the second section now, which is the ones where, as black, I have to face moves like e4 and white bringing his knight to c3 and playing h4 as well. So one critical game was the one Buchanan against Basman. Now from the start position, this began pawn to e4, pawn to g5, white pawn to d4, black pawn to h6. Here white played pawn to h4. Black, of course, had to capture, g takes h4. One of the advantages of this move for white is that he does gain much greater control of the e5 square immediately, and black can't bank on that square being in his possession. Now white played here knight to f3, black bishop to g7. Now white played knight to c3. Now this formation does allow black to play pawn to c5, but pawn to c5 is still very dangerous because it opens up the position so rapidly. Of course, white can prevent pawn to c5 happening by bringing his knight to c3 and his bishop to e3 instead of playing an early knight to f3. Now, black possibly shouldn't go pawn to c5 here. I tried it out anyway. There are other ways to play this position with d6 and then c6, or d6 and knight c6 possibly. Anyway, here black played pawn to c5, and white played the strong answer, bishop to e3. Black now played queen to a5. White played queen to d2. I think it's already quite difficult for black. If he takes on d4, white recaptures with the bishop. He could try knight f6 to g4. That might be an idea. I don't think it's so good. Now, in the game, black played knight c6, but if white had now captured on c5, then black really has quite a bad game. If he takes on c3, the tripled pawns really aren't a weakness for white, and as I've said before, the pawn at c5 keeps the black game suppressed and his bishop undeveloped. So really this variation, I feel, is busted in this position if the best black can do is knight c6. Now here actually white in the game let black off by playing pawn to d5, and after that black managed to maintain equality. Black played knight e5, white knight takes e5, black bishop takes e5, and now white's plan plays pawn f4, black bishop takes c3, white queen takes c3, black queen takes c3, white pawn takes c3. This still may look a little precarious for black, but I think it's okay. Now black played knight to f6, hitting the e4 pawn. If white plays bishop d3, black would play pawn to c4 here. So white played bishop takes c5, black knight takes e4, white bishop to d4, black pawn to f6. This is an important move, limiting the power of the bishop on d4. White's got the two bishops, but there are enough pawns on the board to interfere with them. Now, after pawn to f6, white played bishop to d3, and how should black play here? Well, black shouldn't go back to d6. He has to go into g3 with his knight, and he's going to prepare to move it round to f5. White played after knight to g3, white played rook takes h4, and now black played pawn to d6. Now, having put his pawn on d6, he ensures that white isn't able to play himself pawn to d6, which would really disrupt the black pawn. So pawn to d6, and now there's going to be a great battle both over the destiny of black's h-pawn and also over the control of f5, because white has a pawn on g2, and if it can get to g4, he can drive any black pieces away from that square. So we get quite subtle play here. White now played bishop f2, black knight to f5, white rook to h2, that's the best move. Now, how would you play as black here? Turn off the tape and have a think. Black chose here to play knight to g7. White played king to d2. And now we've got the problem of white playing rook to h1 and putting pressure on the h-pawn. If black plays pawn to h5, white would play bishop e2. And then bishop g4 is no good because there's a pin on the h-pawn. Also king to f7 isn't much good. White can play probably pawn to g4 straight away, and then he would get a passed h-pawn. So this is white's threat, and from the position of diagram 2, how would you play for black? Black played king to f7. White moved his rook from a1 to h1. Black played pawn to h5. Now with this series of moves, pawn to g4 is no good because black can play bishop takes g4. So white played bishop e2, and black just sidestepped with rook g8. And after bishop takes h5 check, knight takes h5, rook takes, black rook takes g2, we got into an endgame which was probably even, slightly better for black. Black didn't quite manage to win it, though he tried for about 50 moves. I think to an extent that game answers some of the queries about the weakness of the black h-pawn. It is in fact a weakness, but there is compensating play along the g-file, as we found in this game, and in fact there was a trade-off of the g-pawn for the h-pawn. We come now to the game against Parameswaran in round 11. By this time in the tournament I'd lost all chance of a reasonable score. That had occurred in the previous round against Horstworth by failing to win. So I decided to play more experimentally. Now, this game is a sort of game where you wonder how much can black's position stand, which is what the game intends to test out. And it seems to show that there are limits to what the black position can withstand. Now, white began e4, black g5, white d4, black h6. Now white played this move h4, which seems quite a useful idea. Black played g takes h4. As I've stated before, I'm not particularly worried about the isolation of the h-pawn. More it is the loss of central control. Now white played his knight to f3, black bishop g7, a white knight to c3. Now this sequence of moves, as we've seen, allows black to play pawn c5, and black chose pawn c5 here. White now played bishop to e3, and this is very similar to as against Buchanan. But here I played pawn to b6 rather than queen a5, offering the sacrifice of the pawn. It probably is not good for white to take it, because black would then plays queen to a5, his knight to a6, to c6, and his rook to b8, and the white king would really have no haven. There'd be a lot of pressure in the centre. Yes, actually after pawn takes c5, pawn takes c5, bishop takes c5, then knight c6, and later queen a5. Now, after b6, white played bishop to c4, and I think you should be able to see the threat. This is to capture on c5 and then play queen to d5, hitting f7 and a8. Well, I saw that, and I played knight c6. White now played here queen to d2. We have a critical position here. Black really wants to play d6, but well, it doesn't look too good. White would take on c5. If black took with the b pawn, then again queen to d5 is very strong. So black played bishop to b7. White took on c5 and black recaptured. And now white played castles queenside. Now here too, black wants to play d6, but it's not possible because of queen to d5, and then the black knight cannot move to e5 because the bishop at b7 hangs. Of course, after queen d5, if e6, then the d pawn goes. So black's position looks a bit precarious. The other move besides d6 that black might consider is knight to f6, and if pawn to e5, then black could go knight to g4. However, after knight to f6, probably the simplest for white is to play rook takes h4. And then he has a threat of e5 because the black knight hasn't got anywhere to go to. Possibly after rook takes h4, well, black could try h5. Then something else comes in. Maybe the knight comes from f3 to g5. Still here, black would have a defense in playing knight from c6 to e5. So, looking at this Parameswaran position, after white's castle queenside, and black plays knight f6, three main attacks seem to be rook takes h4, to which black could answer h5, knight takes h4, and in that case black could answer knight to e5, because if knight f5, then knight takes c4. So after black's knight e5, white could play bishop to e2, possibly also could play bishop b5, but anyway, look at bishop e2. Then black could capture on e4, knight takes e4. Black knight takes e4, white bishop takes e4. That would put paid to the threat of knight f5. Now the third possibility for white after knight f6 is pawn to e5, knight g4, queen to d5. Now I looked here at black defending his f7 square by playing knight takes e5, white knight takes e5, black knight on c6 takes e5. Then white could play queen takes b7, and if knight takes c4, then rook takes d7, and white's got a strong attack here. So after this move, queen to d5, it's possible for black to play e6. White, queen takes c5. Now white has also threats of moving his knight round to b5 or e4. So an idea here for black is to play bishop f8. The white queen has got no real squares, so he'll probably play queen to b5, hitting the black bishop. And now possibly knight to a5. And this has some threats of bishop c6 or pawn to a6. And at the moment white can't get a knight round to d6 that quickly. So this position may be okay. So let us return now to diagram 3 after white has castled kingside, queenside, sorry. And in this position I didn't play knight f6, which we've seen might hold for black. Instead, rook to b8. The idea of this move was that if white plays queen to d5, black is able to answer with knight to e5. Now white actually played bishop takes c5, and black played pawn to d6. Again, it seems that white, if he plays queen to d5, is met by knight to e5. And this is perfectly adequate defense. However, white found a different move in this position. Perhaps you'd like to look for it yourselves. Well, white's position is so strong that he has a very good queen move here. Queen to f4, hitting the f7 square. And black can't block with e6 because of his d6 pawn hanging. The worst thing is that black cannot play knight to f6, the natural defense, because of white's pawn to e5. So black had to play bishop to f6 here. Now, how would you play as white in this position? It looks very strong to play pawn to e5 here, but in fact black is able to answer with knight takes e5, white knight takes e5, and now not bishop takes e5 but bishop to g5, and black wins the white queen, and white's subsequent attack is not sufficient to compensate him for this. Well, white avoided this trap, and instead of playing pawn to e5, so have white's knight back on f3, pawn on e4, black bishop on f6, and a black knight on c6. So instead of pawn to e5, white played knight to d5, threatening, of course, to capture on f6, and then play pawn to e5. So, have you any defences black here? How would you play? Well, the defence side intended, and the one I played, was to play bishop takes b2 check. And this allows black to make a few discovered checks along the b file, which help him at least to avoid serious material loss, though not serious positional defects. White played king takes b2, and now black played pawn to e5. Okay, how would you now play as white? Well, here it's possible, I think, to play queen e3 for white, and after pawn takes bishop, to play queen takes c5, when black's position is still fairly precarious. But white found an even stronger move, and this was to play knight takes e5. Black played knight takes e5, and white played bishop to b3, so white just gives the piece back in order to maintain his very powerful pressure on the black game. So after bishop to b3, black played bishop takes d5, white rook takes d5. And there isn't too much to be done for black here. If black plays queen f6, white would just exchange the queens and then capture on d6 with the bishop. And though black may play moves like knight to c4 check and knight takes bishop, they don't affect the outcome. He ends up quite a few pawns down. So instead of playing queen to f6, black did play queen to g5 in that position, white took on g5, and black played h takes g5. White still gained a vastly superior position, but black, because of his pawns on the king side, even though he was a couple of pawns down, actually gained considerable drawing chances because he has a potential, if he survives the worst, he has a potential passed pawn on the king side, the passed h pawn, and it was very far advanced. Possibly a critical moment came on move 28, when white played bishop takes knight on g8, and black, instead of sacrificing a piece, could have taken the endgame, I believe, by capturing with the rook. Even though this would have lost him quite a few pawns, he still may have gained enough activity to exchange off all the kingside pawns and hope to hold the endgame, 2 against 0 on the queen side. Okay, so that game I think was a very interesting one theoretically. If black's play is to hold water, then possibly he has to play knight f6. Lest you think that c5 lines of this type are completely destroyed, I'll show you a new idea which I bumped into in a simultaneous display recently, a suggestion of one of the opponents in the display when we were looking over one of the games. Now this one went e4, black played g5, some position number 0, e4, g5, d4, h6, and white plays, now what does white play? Yeah, white can play knight c3, black bishop g7, white pawn to black bishop to g7, white bishop to c4, and at this point black can play pawn to c5. Well, here I said that my tape had shown that pawn c5 was not possible because white plays bishop to e3, and on the tape I mainly only look at queen a5, but the question was raised, why not play queen to b6 in this position? And this does have some possibilities. It looks ridiculous because white can play knight to d5, but in that case black has got 2 possible moves. One is queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen back to d8, and after bishop to c3 then possibly pawn to e6. Now if white pawn takes c5, black pawn takes d5, white bishop takes g7, black rook to h7. Possibly black ends up a piece ahead here. Funny sort of line. Now that's one idea, that you move the queen around, lose time with the queen, but still white's pieces get dislodged. The other idea from the position, well, let's give that another diagram. We'll call that diagram 4. And after black queen b6, knight d5, black can take the b pawn off, queen takes b2, offering the exchange. Something similar to this was suggested on the Macho Grob tape to do with the pawn to c4 lines. Now if white goes knight c7 check, king d8, knight takes a8, here queen c3 check looks pretty good. Pawn takes d4 also possible, I think not so good though because of bishop d2. And if pawn to d3 then just rook c1. So queen c3 check. And black picks up the bishop, and the knight on a8 is obviously right for picking as well. So let's return to diagram 4. White doesn't take the exchange yet. He plays rook to b1, black queen to a3. Now if white takes the exchange, looks like the same thing happens. So white plays rook to b3. And black, well, Oh, black here could go queen a5 check, so that would hold out for black. You may consider that black hasn't got any development, but take heart from remembering the poison pawn variation of the Najdorf, where black's development was equally non-existent. So rook b3 doesn't seem right. Possibly queen to d2, that's been suggested, and that stops the black queen from checking on a5. Now here in this position, black could play fearless moves like knight f6, that hits e4, or knight c6, that hits d4, both offering again the exchange, or maybe the rook, depends what you call it, the rook on a8. Or black can play something safe, like king to d8, and again, white would need to demonstrate a win in this position. I'm also wondering if black couldn't play c takes d4 here. White plays bishop takes d4, black bishop takes d4, and white queen takes d4. That hits the rook on h8. So black here plays queen a5 check. Looks like white would go pawn to c3 here. And black would now play rook to h7. And this looks like another source of lunatic inspiration. Black's threatening knight c6, of course, and probably if white played queen e5 here, threatening knight c7 check, black could play knight c6, because if knight c7 check, king d8, queen takes queen, knight takes queen, black's hitting the bishop at c4, so he's not too worried that his rook on a8 is going. Another possibility might be rook, this is after black's rook h7. The possibility could be rook b5, black queen to d8, white queen to e5. Here d6 looks quite possible. I was looking first at knight c6, which is also an idea, but maybe d6 is quite adequate. After knight c6, knight c7 check, king f8, queen f5, queen takes c7, queen takes h7, knight e5, rook takes knight, queen takes bishop. Actually this is okay for black again, because white hasn't got any other development. He's just sacrificed all his attacking pieces. Right, well, given that idea, I expect we'll have to try it out in practice sometime. But it shows that c5 might be possible, say, against bishop c4 after all, because of the bishop at c4 is in a hanging situation. So black gets more chances than he does in the other c5 lines. Now I'd like to switch over to the white side, just to look at the game against Ravi Kumar. This one also did not go well. It began g4, d5, h3, e5, bishop g2. Now black played knight c6. Well, on the Macho tape I looked at variations like c4 and also c3 followed by d4. Now I did suggest, but I didn't play this sort of continuation. Haven't played it much, I don't think. That was for white to play d3, black bishop e6, and now white c3. Now Ravi Kumar played knight ge7, white played knight f3, and black played pawn to f6. And here I played queen to a4. Black went queen to d7. Now, considering here that I was a move up on such lines as I might get with black, I thought I might be able to afford to play pawn to c4 here. In fact, this was not true. And maybe I had to choose some other sort of continuation, like knight to d2 or possibly b4. As I haven't played this line very much, I'm not really sure how white should continue. It's also possible, I think, to play bishop to e3. Yes, this might be an idea. And then later say knight to d2 to b3. But yeah, bishop e3 might be possible too. Anyway, I played against Ravi Kumar, I played c4, and this didn't turn out at all well. Even though one of the points of moving the queen out to a4 is to get the possibility of playing the move c4 without losing a pawn. Here Kumar played d takes c4, white d takes c4. Now moved the knight round to c8. This I found unexpected, because usually one expects the knight to go to g6 and have a go at the weak squares at f4 or h4. But in fact the knight is coming round to b6, and it's impossible at the moment for white really to avoid the loss of a pawn. I played against knight c8, I played bishop to e3, preparing to answer knight b6 by bishop takes knight. Black is shut out with bishop to b4 check, and after a little while I noticed that the c pawn is going because it's no longer defended. Well, already white's having to pull a few stops out, and I did find the move knight from f3 to d2, offering the c pawn, in which case white would get quite considerable play. After bishop takes c4, I think white could play, now what could he play? Queen to c2. Possibly black goes bishop to d5. White could now play bishop to e4. And what white's trying to do is to get a piece to the d file fairly rapidly in order to embarrass the black queen. Now actually that variation may not be quite right. I was doing it from memory, but after white's knight f to d2 on move 11, and we'll give that another diagram. That can be diagram number 5. I think if black plays bishop takes c4, white could actually go knight c3 and then threaten to castle queenside. This could be better than queen back to c2. I think Kumar thought that after bishop takes c4 I'd take on c6 and then pick up his bishop on b4, but quite obviously if white does this, black recaptures with the queen hitting the rook at h1, so that line doesn't in fact work. But Ravi Kumar isn't very good at tactics. Anyway, he looks at the pawn for a little bit and then he didn't take it. So he played positional move instead, which was well, it was to castle. I think here again I made an error, which I quite often make this sort of error, and that is to castle in this position. With queen c2 white could have been okay, but with his king castled on the edge of the board, when black opened up with f5 it was very difficult to hold the king side intact without making other concessions. The Grob meets its match, side 2. Now, I'd like now to look at the game Pritchett against Basman. So Pritchett was at least an international master, so I did play some reasonably strong players in the tournament. Now this game is sort of on the dividing line between the knight c3 lines and the quieter c3 lines. White plays his bishop to d3, but then he does capture on c5. This opening had been seen before in my game against Whiteley and also the game against Wells. Now this one adds a new dimension to the game with Whiteley, so I think it is of theoretical interest. White went e4, g5, d4, h6. White bishop to d3. This is the quiet line as practiced by many people, including none. The bishop isn't particularly aggressively placed on d3, of course. Black played bishop g7, and now white played knight e2, and black played here c5. White now captured on c5, and black played queen to a5 check. Now here Wells, as we know, played c3, which was a very interesting move. Pritchett played knight b1 to c3, black took on c5, white bishop to e3, black queen to a5, white queen to d2, black knight went to c6. Here white played pawn to h4. Now, after some thought, black played pawn to g4. Again, he didn't want to take on h4 that much because white might be able to play f4, but possibly taking on h4 might have been a better choice again to keep the king side open. Anyway, black played pawn to g4 here, and now white's move was castle's queenside. Now this actually is a much better move than the way Whiteley played. Whiteley was put his king on the king's side, and as a result his queenside pawns were that much weaker. Here white puts his king on the queen's side, not just to have attacking chances, but to guard the pawns of b2 and c2. And black, if he doesn't get a good attack going, won't also find the endgame so useful to him. So to some extent the pressure of the bishop along the diagonal is negated by the white king being on the queen side. Now also Pritchett is an expert playing against the Sicilian dragon. He even tried the white side against Miles and got smashed for his pains. But here he intends to play a sort of Sicilian dragon, except that he doesn't think that black can castle kingside, and if black can't castle kingside, then he can't swing his rook over to the c-file to get some counterattack going. So therefore the black king will stay in the centre, and white is going to plan to push through in the centre later with attempt to play f4 and e5. So this was a positional problem that black didn't solve very well in the game, as you'll see from the subsequent events. And it's something that black has actually got out of the opening with what looks like a reasonable position. He seems to have good grip on the black squares and on the e5 square as well, but we'll see how white gradually prized away this advantage from him. Now after castle's queenside, black played pawn d6, white went bishop c4, and both sides sort of developed pieces. Knight f6, bishop b3. Oh, wait a minute, knight f6, white moved his knight to d4, black played bishop d7, White went bishop to b3, and black played rook to c8. Maybe possible a6 b5 is better, but this is very unclear. So rook c8 looks a sensible idea anyway. Now white continued with his plan of playing in the centre. He played rook h to e1, and perhaps you might like to switch off and study this position a bit. Now the obvious move for black in this position is to move his knight to e5. The variation I didn't particularly like was white answering knight to f5, black playing bishop takes, white playing pawn takes f5. Now here what has happened is that white is opening up the e file, and though it looks well blocked by the knight at e5, there are some problems for black to solve. I suppose black actually, black still can't castle. He could possibly play something like h5 and then try and castle kingside, and white might have the edge, but nothing more. There's an attempt by black also to make progress in this position by playing knight c4, white bishop takes c4, black rook takes c4. Now black is actually threatening to take the pawn on c4, but here the opening of the white e file begins to tell against black. White could play bishop to f4, and of course black cannot take on f5 now. The reason for this being that white would play rook takes e7 check, king takes e7, and then queen takes d6 check, and then queen to d8 mate. So maybe it was this unfortunate variation which dissuaded me against playing knight to e5, though this might still be the correct plan to follow. The other move in the position after white's rook h1 to e1, and that's going to be diagram 6. The other idea would be to play your king to f8. The point of this move is that it puts paid to white playing a move like knight to f5 at any particular time because of the combinative answer knight takes e4, which in this case cannot be answered by knight takes knight, or it can't be answered by white playing knight takes bishop check because the black king is on f8. So king f8 though is a very committal move because you're not able to castle and connect the rooks, but still it could possibly be the right one. Now black didn't choose either of these moves, king f8 or knight e5. Instead he tried to maintain his blockade on the e5 square, which didn't come off at all. He played knight to h5, this is from diagram 6, white played king b1, black played bishop to e5, and now white just pounded through the centre with f4, g takes f, g takes f, and it's all up for black, of course. He played knight f6, white f4, black bishop takes d4, white bishop takes d4, and now pawn to e5. Black actually managed to survive in this position, though of course he's had to make a tremendous positional concession in order to prevent white from playing the move pawn e5, which would have smashed him to bits. Black's played himself pawn to e5, but then he's very weak down the d file, and of course along the f file as well, and along any file you care to mention. At any rate, Pritchett didn't quite manage to get through, though I'm happy to concede that this position is seriously deficient for black. Now, turning to the games with the white pieces, it really is interesting how nearly all the opponents play the pawn to c6 lines, though when they face the Grob as white, they play a more aggressive line like knight to c3. So most of these lines are going to be the c6 ones. Let's look first at the game against Byway, which was a very serious defeat. This began g4. Now where's the game? g4, d5, h3, e5, bishop g2. Here Byway chose to play h5. White took on h5 and black took back with the rook. Well, so far so good. Things look alright for white at this stage. Possibly white could play pawn to c4 here, as black's doing all these flank actions. White could take some action in the centre. But anyway, I didn't play that. I played pawn to d4, which was similar to my game against Spielman, with the colours reversed. However, here black didn't take on d4, allowing possibly e3. He played pawn to e4. And now white played pawn to c4, and black defended his centre with pawn to c6. This in some ways can be an improvement on the normal c6 lines, because with the move h5 in already, black is able to support his pawn with pawn to f5. Now white continued to put pressure on the centre by playing knight c3. Black played bishop to d6. White played queen to b3, and black played knight to e7. Now here white was dogged by not knowing whether to capture on d5 here or not. Of course, he could have captured on d5 and then played knight to b5, and that would have gained the advantage of the two bishops. But possibly white is hoping for more in this position, so he didn't play that move. Instead, white played, as similar to the game against Kudrin, white played bishop d2, and black played knight to d7. Now again, I think it's quite possible for white to capture on d5. It might have been the correct way to play. Instead, white castled queenside, and black here again, black could have taken on c4. He didn't. He played knight to f6. Okay, we're definitely right for now for white to capture on d5 and then play possibly f3, because the way white played it here was to play an immediate f3 in this position. And you might like to see how you would continue as black in this position. Your centre's under fire, but you have a very strong series of moves here. Well, Byway now took himself on c4. Pawn takes c4, white played queen takes c4. Now black played bishop e6, gaining a tempo against the queen. Queen went to a4. And here the winning move is pawn to e3, which is what Byway played. This messes up white's development for sufficiently long period of time to enable black to get his pieces over and attack the white king. So white had to take the pawn, and black here played rook to a5. He could also have tried, I think, knight to d5. Rook a5 is better. Queen to c2 happened, and now black simply took off on a2. White took on a2, and black played rook takes a2 here. White here played queen to b3. Now again, because of white's awkward development, black could actually have taken immediate advantage of white by playing rook to a1 check, and then after, I think, king to c2, rook takes rook, king takes rook. Now something like knight to d5, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves back to f2. Oh no, I tell a lie. Not knight to d5. Knight from e7 to f5. And then if the white bishop moves back to f2, probably something like bishop to g3. And if white captures on g3, black will just play queen takes d4 check. So this position, white hasn't had time really to mobilize his massive center before he actually gets defeated. Now return to diagram 7. Now by the way, who played this whole game with a strange mixture of aggression and uncertainty, didn't play rook checks. He in fact played his rook back to a5, and white was able to recoup the position to some degree by playing bishop d2, black rook b5, white queen to a2. White put his queen there because he thought if he moved his queen elsewhere, then black would just advance his a pawn down the board and disrupt the white king side, possibly even making a queen if white refused to open the game. So queen went to a2. Not very good, but anyway, that's all we could think of. Black now played knight f5, hitting the d pawn. White, I think, here could have played the move pawn to e3. It is precarious, but then if black plays knight to g3, white has some form of defense here. Yes, after pawn to e3, if black goes knight to g3, white could either consider rook h2, knight e2 check, knight takes knight, bishop takes, and then pawn to f4, when the black bishop isn't very well placed on h2. Maybe white can consider sacking the exchange by f4, and after black takes on h1 and white recaptures, white has the plan of moving his knight to f3 and then into e5, and trying to gain compensation for the exchange in this manner with his two bishops and his active control of the center. However, white seemed to miss his last chance at this stage, because he played here the very aggressive move pawn to e4, having in mind that black wouldn't be able to capture the pawn. Now black, let's see, do you think that black can capture the pawn? Well, black captured the pawn, and white now played his intended move, which was bishop to c3. And how would you now play as black here? Well, actually black can play pawn to c5 here, but if he does, white doesn't of course regain his pawn by bishop takes knight, because after pawn takes bishop, rook takes, there's bishop f4 check. Instead of that, white would play queen to a4, pinning the rook at b5 and threatening to win it. So black would play queen d7, and I believe at this point white would play bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now rook takes d4. And this position could end up reasonably for black. Sorry, for white. So if you chose pawn to c5 for black, maybe turn off the tape and try and look for another move. Well, black's move that he played was the spectacular, this is from diagram 8, spectacular knight takes e4, and he now begins to make a collection of the white kingside pieces. I don't think there's any real defense after knight takes e4 by black, and I certainly didn't find it. Played rook takes d4, black played queen g5 check, white king went to d1. Of course, if he goes to b1, then knight takes c3 check wins instantly. So king to d1, queen takes, oh no, he didn't play queen takes g2 yet. He played knight f2 check, king e1, queen takes g2, rook takes d6. Now simply knight takes h1. White knight went to e2. Black queen takes f3. White had a pawn. Bishop takes g7. Queen f2 check. King d2. Knight to g3. This threatens the knight, of course. White played rook e6 check, but black wouldn't capture. He played king d7, and now white really had virtually no moves to play. He played bishop d4, queen f5, and after rook h6, rook d5, he did the correct thing, which was to resign. Again, this game highlights the problem white often has, which is a surfeit of moves in this position. It's up to him to initiate something. That is in the early stages of the game. And we saw the same trouble with my game with Ravi Kumar. And against Ravi Kumar I castled, and this gave him a target of attack. Same thing happened against Byway. Possibly it should be a better way for white to play to temporize and to not commit himself with such straightforward moves as castling and then f3, as in this game against Byway. For example, after 9 bishop d2 and black played knight d7, it might be an idea here for white to play pawn to h4, again not yet committing his king to any particular spot. If black plays knight f6, here white could possibly take on d5 and then play rook to c1, and he has a threat of going bishop to g5 at some point. But it does seem to me that the castling maneuver got white into trouble, though he might have been able to do it if he'd have first taken on d5, and then black wouldn't have gained so many tempi against the white queen. Now the game against Large followed similar lines. It's interesting how so many of the opponents played the move h4, h5. Maybe they courted off each other. You get this sort of infection in a tournament. Now here, this was slightly better for white. White played g4, d5, h3, e5, bishop g2, c6, d4, e4, now c4. Here black played h5, and white could have taken, but he chose to play pawn to g5 here. Safety play. Well, this of course enables black eventually to castle kingside if he wants to. Now black could have continued with moves like bishop d6. He chose his own curious plan, knight to e7, white knight c3, now black knight to a6. He's going to strong point his d5 pawn. White player played pawn to h4, black went knight g6, white went bishop to e3. Black bishop came to e6. Now here I'm not really able to play, of course, knight h3, which is the move I want, so my development is not going to be very smooth in this position. Whereas black's has got a clear plan of moving his bishop, castling kingside, and then attacking white where he will. That's why I chose to get the queens off at this point by playing queen to a4. Black played queen d7 because he was threatened by c takes d5. White exchanged, c takes d5, c takes d5, and now took the queens off. Queen takes d7, king takes d7. Now this endgame could be good for white because of black's weak pawn at d5. But as black was able to defend it quite solidly, he didn't have such a bad game. In fact, white here played f3, black took on f3. Possibly here white should take with the knight. In fact, if he takes with the white knight, of course black is able then to put things immediately on the e file. I took in fact with the bishop in order to chain the rook on h8 to the defense of the h-pawn. And also I had a long-winded plan of playing bishop f2, e3, knight to e2, and gradually to develop the pieces in that way, maybe get the knight to f4 later. But this long-winded plan was too long-winded, so it looks like knight takes f3 would have been much better than the move played. Even though black is then able to make moves like bishop d6 and rook from h8 to e8 to immediately put pressure down the e file. And white's got some uncomfortable squares himself on g3 and f4, which black is threatening to invade in. So I played bishop takes f3, and now the game began to go into black's favour. Black went knight c7, strong pointing his pawn. White went bishop f2, black bishop to d6. White played pawn to e3. Now black played rook a f8. Now have a look at this position, decide whether you think white can play knight e2 here. Yes, I had intended to play knight e2, but then after f6, pawn takes f6, and white plays rook takes f6, hitting the bishop. White didn't play rook h f8. Of course, he'd moved his rook from a to f8. That's quite clear, because he needed his other rook on h8 to defend the h pawn. So he plays rook a f8, and now he's played f6, e takes f6, and the rook's gone recaptured on f6. Now white's bishop's attacked, so he moves it back to g2. Black plays rook f1 now. Rook from h8 to f8, two pieces attacking the bishop. White, if he moves his bishop back to g1, this at first sight looks okay, because the bishops are keeping the rooks out of the way, and then white would presumably be able to castle. But in fact it's not so simple, because here black can play knight to e7, knight from g6 to e7, and if white castles, black can play rook to g6, and white's under a lot of pressure in this position. Now return your pieces to diagram 9, please. Now after black's rook a f8, I here decided that the intended maneuver knight to e2 is not possible, so I did what I could with pawn to e4, and this probably shouldn't have come off. Black took on e4, white played bishop takes e4. Black could here have gone rook to e8. I think he played knight to f4. White at last developed his knight to f3, and black's knight from c7 went to d5. Now white played knight e5 check, and here black made an error. He should have gone king to e7 when it's a pretty unclear position, but white may be still in quite a lot of danger. At any rate, black thought he'd be getting the superior endgame, but grievously misjudged. He played bishop takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and now bishop to d5, aiming for good knight against bad bishop ending. Well, that's okay as long as black can develop his other pieces, but he doesn't get round to it. White took on d5, black played knight takes d5, white went c4. Here again black, I think, erred. He should have played knight to f4 here, but instead he played knight e7. Seemed to be in a complete dream at this stage of the game. Now white just walked through rook d1 check, king e6, rook d6 check, king takes e5, bishop to g3 check, king e4. Here white castled kingside. maybe some attacking threats to the black king here. Not actually that easy to mate the black king. At any rate, white played rook to d8, and black played rook to d8, and white invaded on the 7th. Rook takes f7. Here, black dropped a piece by accident. He played rook takes d6. Rook takes e7 check, and then white played bishop takes d6. In fact, white almost managed to mess up this piece upending, but he still won the game, so he should have piece up. Now, the game against Hawksworth was really a con by black, offering white an endgame which is only slightly better for him. He went g4, d5, h3, e5, bishop g2, c6, d4. Here black took and white took on d4. Black played queen b6. Well, I mentioned knight f3, which I played against. Actually, knight f3 here doesn't work, does it? Because of bishop c5. Bishop c5 doesn't work because the queen takes g7. No. So I've mentioned knight f3, which I think happened against Hebden in the Cotswolds. Slight advantage to white. In this game I tried queen e5 check. Didn't do very well. Got a bad position. I think in future I'm going to play queen to f4 in the next game, after black's queen b6. Then if black really wants to exchange queens by queen b4 check, knight c3, queen takes f4, bishop takes f4. He gets a long way behind in development, and white's threatening moves like pawn to e4. Say black plays bishop to b4 here, I think white could drop his bishop back to d2. Maybe black plays knight d7. White can now castle queenside, and he's threatening moves like pawn to f4 and pawn to e4. And this could be a good endgame situation for him. Black's got poor development for his c8 bishop, and he's got weaknesses on the d6 square. Now, we won't go into the game against Hawksworth because white was just struggling all the way through. And we'll look instead at the game Basman against Dawson. This will be the last game on the tape, just to encourage you, make you realise the Grob isn't finished, despite this very pale showing in the British. And here we see our friend, the black player, walking into one of the worst variations. This game began g4, d5, h3, e5, bishop to g2, c6. White plays d4, and now instead of e4, which is better, black played knight to d7. And now comes white pawn to c4, smashing up the black centre. Black here played d takes c4, accepting the pawn sacrifice. White took on e5. Black knight takes e5. As you remember, queen a5 check is Basman against De La Motha. And now white played queen takes d8 check, king takes d8. So the black king being dislodged gave white even attacking chances in the ending. White here played knight c3, and black went bishop to b4. And as usual in this position, I chose to play bishop e3, not yet advancing the kingside pawns, because they can become weak if you advance them too soon. Now black chose to move king to e8 to get his king out of the checking range, and white went f4, knight back to g6, white knight to f3. Black now brought his bishop back to d6 to attack the f4 pawn. Now black's going to be able to invade into some of the weakened squares on the white king side, but overall white's got so much space that he doesn't mind this. So white here played pawn to f5, black bishop to g3 check, white bishop to f2. This is to get the king off their first rank. Bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2. knight came into f4. So black's achieved his part of his aim, which is to get rid of the white bishop, and he still is at the moment a pawn up. At any rate, now white moved in, knight to e5. That of course hits the c4 pawn. Knight takes g2, king takes g2. And here black played pawn to b5. Now, how would you play in this position for white? Just a little test to make sure you didn't play knight takes c6, which would be answered by bishop takes b7. Instead, white chose to play knight to e4, which is an interesting move. Both knights very centrally placed, threatening to attack the king very severely. Now, black in this position played pawn to f6. I'd like you to turn off the tape and decide what you'd play for white here. Well, I looked a long time at the move. Well, I looked first at knight takes c6. But if black plays bishop b7, knight d6 check, king d7, knight takes b7, king takes c6. White's got his pawn back, but he has really activated the black king, and the white knight is in a really rather poor position. So this endgame situation wouldn't help white. So let's go back now to diagram 10. Now the other move which looks very good for white is to move his knight from e4 to d6 check. And black plays, let me see what does he play. He plays, I think, king to e7. White plays knight from e5 to f7. Okay, so far so good. Looks so easy. Winning a rook, but it doesn't, because now black plays knight to h6. And if white plays knight takes rook, black will play king takes knight. And now it's hard to it's rather hard to save that knight in the corner. Well, anyway, I looked at these lines for some time, and in a bit of disappointment, but anyway, it's no use going forward and just sort of developing the black position. So I decided to go back, because black still retains his problems of development. So from diagram 10 I didn't go forward into the attack, which only helps black to get out of it. The knight went back to f3, and black still has these development problems. The knight's now threatening to come into d4, among other things. Now after knight to f3, black chooses to play king to e7. That stops knight d6 check. White brought his rook from h1 to d1. Right, back on the winning track. Black g6. White went knight to d4, threatening knight takes c6 check. And black played pawn takes f5. White did play knight takes c6 check. King to e6. Okay, now how would you continue as white here? Again, white's got loads of pieces in the attack, but not really clear if there's any sort of mating continuation. So he continues generally to attack black, but not specifically. He plays g takes f5 check, king takes f5. Okay, how would you play as white here? Well, I don't know what move you chose. You may even have come up with something better than me. You can try knight d6 check, king to g6, knight takes b5, but I don't like that too much after bishop to b7. That theme always seems to crop up. So to retain the power of the position, White didn't play knight d6 check, he played instead king to f3. The idea here is to be able to sometime check on g1 if the black king tries to escape in that direction. So king to f3 happened, and black played king to g6. White went rook g1 check, king to f7, and now rook from a1 to d1. Black here played bishop takes h3. Okay, again, how would you play as white in this position? White now moved rook to g3, which is very embarrassing for black, who hasn't got many squares left for this bishop. If it goes back to e6, now white's got a strong continuation here. I'll just try and think of it. Yes, knight to, after bishop e6, knight to d8 check simply wins the exchange. So instead of bishop e6, black played bishop to f5, and white played knight d6 check. Black played king to e6. Okay, what do you choose in this position? Well, you could try to mate black by playing knight takes bishop, king takes knight, and now rook to d6, which looks awfully strong because it threatens pawn to e4 mate. But black can defend adequately by playing rook e8, and after pawn to e4 he'll just take it. And if you play then something like knight to d4 check, you don't get too far. Well, actually you do get a little way, but not far enough. You certainly don't mate black. So let's have black's rook back on a8, the black bishop on f5, white rook on d1, and white knights on e4, c6, and c6, and the black king on e6. Black king's on f7, isn't he? So knight d6 check, king to e6 was played. White could here play knight takes b5. Instead he chose to play rook to g7, which is very strong because it has quite a few threats when you think about it. Now black only thought about one of them. He played pawn to a6, and white played one of his threats, which was to play knight to f7, very materialistically going after the rook on h8. Well, black didn't find much to do about that. He played knight to e7. And unfortunately white didn't take the rook on f8. He moved his rook down from d1 to d6, and that was mate. Well, I hope that all your games with the Grob end in this fashion, and it's very nice to see the white pieces all developed and all working together, attacking the black king. Well, I hope you'll agree from this analysis that the Grob still lives. Of the 11 games, possibly the one which I feel most insecure about was the game Basman Byway as a sort of an attack on the system.